Hello and welcome to the Emil podcast for another episode where we'll be investigating trauma, post-traumatic stress, complex post-traumatic stress, dissociation, structural dissociation, and all things in between. This episode is the first of two episodes that I have with Dr. Cecile Boganin, who is a clinical psychologist and who gives a whole rundown on what complex post-traumatic stress looks like, what trauma looks like, what dissociation is, and what structural dissociation is and is not. How to work with it will come in the second episode, but we will tend to make a reference to a number of therapeutic approaches before going into them in a little bit of depth in the next episode. I would say that there's potential for a standalone episode just talking about treatments. Today we're conceptualizing structural dissociation and trauma and getting a better grip of what it actually is from a clinical point of view and also for an interested layman. So I hope you enjoy it. Today I'm joined by Cecile Boganin, Dr. Cecile Boganin, who is a clinical psychologist and specializes in treating conditions such as anxiety, depression, grief, trauma, childhood and complex trauma, dissociation, adjustment difficulties, life transitions, identity confusion, interpersonal conflict and relationship problems, self-harm and personality disorders, and a whole lot more. I mean, that's quite a mouthful, Cecile, but I just wanted to give a bit more of a context on yourself because you conducted your doctoral dissertation on the impacts of memory in self-harming behaviors, and you have mentioned that you apply a lot of what you've learned back during your dissertation to the clinical work that you do, and you're very well studied in various modalities such as schema therapy, EMDR, CBT, DBT, all these acronyms that psychologists and counselors and therapists love to use. But it's great to have you on board today, Cecile. And today we're not going to be talking specifically about those sorts of things, but we may refer to them. We will be talking about trauma, dissociation, structural dissociation, what that looks like, what that means, and how we can come to a better understanding of it, pretty much. So, Cecile, I'd love to have you on board. Thank you for being with me today.
Thanks for having me, Emil. It's a pleasure.
Cecile, I want to give you the opportunity. I know I've read a whole bunch of biographical details, but if there's anything I missed or anything you wanted to add or take away from what I've said so far about who you are, what you're all about, it's a good opportunity to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and or anything further to what I've already said.
Thanks. Yes, so what you've mentioned is the initial bio that I've written about myself. Now I specialize more in trauma presentations, personality disorders, and dissociative disorders. I'm a accredited schema therapist, EMDR therapist through EMDR, and a consultant in training.
Yeah, it's quite a varied background, which is something that I really appreciate in psychologists and therapists who go out after their training, their initial training, and go and do a whole range of other types of training that will be very helpful for their client presentation. I've seen that that's something that was very valuable to you, and you've ever since I've known you, Cecile, you've always been doing something, expanding yourself and learning more things. And that's why I thought it'd be amazing to have you on board to discuss what you're currently interested in and working on and treating. So this is the time for that.
Thanks, Emil. Thanks. And I think, as you know, I've worked in the community mental health sector as I graduated, and that was this amazing, overwhelming experience where I was thrown in a deep end, and most of the stuff that we learned in the psych were applicable, but that was definitely not enough considering the level of trauma that the clientele was experiencing and presenting with. So that was a very, very steep, learning curve for me.
Yeah, and for me, I know that whenever somebody works in the community health sector, and whether it's addiction or personality disorders or other types, there's a whole lot more to it, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it's an
Yeah.
incredible experience when you graduate, and yes, lots and lots of learning.
Yeah, certainly is. And I wanted to, well, I'm happy to just jump on into it because in terms of understanding these presentations and just people listening in today, whether they're clinicians or just members of the community, just that want to learn a little bit more about what trauma, what dissociation is, and perhaps more from a clinical perspective, what structural dissociation is. I want to start off with definitions. I know that when we start off with definitions, we can really get a better sense of what we're talking about. So I'm going to start very easily. What is trauma?
So if we use the definition of trauma based on the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health, trauma is when one is exposed to death or threatened death, a serious injury, or sexual assault. And it can be either experienced or witnessed. It can be learned about a close relative or a friend. And the DSM also mentions that a slight difference in the definition for first responders. So individual like police officers who are involved in repeated exposure to child abuse, so very abusive content, or human remains. And so that really goes somehow hand in hand with the definition of trauma from the trauma literature, which is the experience of an intense, sudden, unpredictable, uncontrollable, and really negative event. And so that is going to impact the individual functioning, their ability to sleep, their memory, their concentration, the level of hyper and hypo alertness. They will experience symptoms such as intrusion, so intrusion of vivid memories about the traumatic event, dreams, flashback, and they will become very avoidant to that because of the intensity of those memories. That the event will also have an impact on their sense of self and how they're going to relate to themselves, the world, and other people. They will also present with dissociative symptoms. They can present with dissociative symptoms such as depersonalization and derealization. But some events are not that violent or life-threatening, especially in children, where they might experience an attachment loss, not because the caregiver died, but because they just left, or intense neglect. And that is going to impact the individual similarly to a violent or life-threatening event. So trauma is more about how a stressful event has impacted the person's sense of self, their body, and how they relate to themselves, the environment, and other people.
It sounds like the DSM, and for those who are listening in and aren't really aware, the DSM has been referred to as the psychiatrist's Bible. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, as you mentioned, has a very specific set of criteria. And the first criterion, as you mentioned, there are certain types of incidences, but then a person's traumatic experience could fall outside of those particular events, especially with kids, and that wouldn't necessarily be considered PTSD from a diagnostic and statistical manual definition, but it most certainly is trauma to the children, the way that I'm hearing you say. Does that sound fair?
Absolutely, yes. And also there are cases of workplace bullying that the person will present with PTSD related symptoms, yet the event doesn't meet the criteria of the DSM.
There's a clinician, Bessel van der Kolk, and he's a researcher as well, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score. He said the main defining feature of trauma is inescapability.
Yes.
And we see those in almost every single event that is considered as traumatic. We feel like we haven't got a handle on what's happening, and we can't seem to overcome the particular event that we're faced with. Does that sound fair?
What do you mean that we're not able to overcome? You mean after the trauma has happened?
Yes. Yeah. Let me no, I don't mean afterwards. I mean, while the trauma is happening, it feels as if we cannot escape the impacts of that particular event. So let me give you an example. A child who is being neglected or is being hurt in a particular way, there is probably no other outlet for them to be able to address that incident. So there's a sense of inescapability, where that's a sense of I cannot be attended to. A first responder who comes in and experiences or attends to a scene where somebody else has died, although they are not in themselves being threatened directly, there is a sense of what's going on here, what is my feeling towards this, and am I able to really regulate this in a very appropriate way in this moment, and it can stay with you afterwards. And what is afterwards could be seen as something I can't escape from, this feeling, this thought, this memory, this experience anymore. I hope I've done an adequate job at describing that, and hopefully Van der Kolk gives that nod of approval if he's ever listening.
No, that sounds, very much like what you've said. And I think it goes to the fact that trauma, when is experienced, leads to a deficit in the integration of the information about the event, because it's too much too fast, it's too intense or too aversive for a child to make sense of it. And so in order to be able to cope with the event, let's say if a child is neglected, where there is no threat to their life, there is no violence. Being neglected, we know that it has a significant impact on the person's sense of self. And so it's how is the child able to deal, or how the child deals with the neglect that impacts their sense of self. Because if there is neglect, then the child is probably going to engage in dissociative patterns, fantasy and daydreaming, or intense sadness, and they can't make sense as to why they're being neglected. And so they're going to attribute a meaning about being neglected. I'm not good enough.
It's not just a matter of feeling like you can't escape. There's a whole lot more to it than the initial experience of it. How a person makes sense of what's happened to them and what that means for them as a person.
If they're able to do so. If they're not
able to do so, what does trauma tend to look like?
So, and I think we tap here a little bit into that structural dissociation, because
before we do that, I think it's important that as we move into it, is it okay if we let's define dissociation and then structural dissociation in terms of what the differences or similarities are for those who may not have heard these terms before. Could you do that for us, Cecile?
So dissociation is used to refer to a few things. And the first one is when we kind of zone out, check out, and daydream. We might be driving and thinking about the shopping list or what's in the fridge, and then we get home and go, oh gosh, I got home, did I stop at the traffic light? So there is this momentary disconnection with the reality, even though we're still able to function. And daydreaming is very healthy. Dissociation also refers to that coping mechanism, right? As per the Polyvegal Theory, we know that when one experiences a stressful or traumatic event, first they are taken away from that ventral vagal nerve where, it's this perception of safety and co-regulation and it's all good. Then we are being moved away from that to a sympathetic state of fight and flight. But if we get a neuroception of life threat, then we are moved away from a sympathetic state into another parasympathetic state where we tap into the dorsal vagal nerve. There, the body shuts down, the metabolic rate really slows down, decreases, and we experience numbness, shutdown, dissociation, freeze, faint. We've got the opiate that is stored here at the back and brainstem that is being released so that we feel numb, so that we feel those dissociative symptoms. So then it is a
and that's a function of the parasympathetic nervous system. From what you're mentioning, wow, that's an interesting distinction, because people usually associate the parasympathetic nervous system just with calming down and getting your body back into equilibrium, but there's a deeper sense that taps into what you're referring to, the dorsal vagal response, which is the shutdown response and preserve energy. That's fascinating.
Yes, that's why it's called the polyvagal theory, because the parasympathetic nerve has the ventral vagal and the dorsal vagal nerve.
Yes. Yeah, smart. Yeah.
And so, yes, so this is the animal defense that happens to us when we are experiencing a stressful or traumatic event. And then dissociation also refers to a set of symptoms. So we've got depersonalization, where we get an out-of-body experience. The person might, explain that they can see themselves from, going through a stressful or the traumatic experience, but they're actually over here looking at the body going through the trauma, or they're walking next to their body. So that's where, so there's an out-of-body experience. That's what depersonalization is. And then we've got derealization, where now the perception about the environment is altered, and it feels very much like a dream or a painting. Some people might experience the carpet moving, the colors are different. So it's an alteration in the perception of the environment.
It's almost like a psychoactive experience where a person is experiencing a how do we say, taking something like LSD or a hallucinogenic, where they experience a difference in the environment because the brain can't filter all the information that's coming through to their system. And so there's a kind of breakdown between reality and the perception of that reality. Now, I'm not going to conflate those two. It just reminds me of these types of experiences that can be synonymous.
Yes, absolutely, because all of those chemicals are stored in our brain, in the autonomic nervous system. Yes.
And so you've got dissociation that represents fundamental changes in a person's reality, from derealization to depersonalization to completely shutting down. And even though you're you could be aware your body is feeling like it's shutting down. There have been stories of people who have been attacked by wild animals and they can't feel anything, but they're still aware of what's happening. Their body's shut down, but they're still awake, so to speak.
Yes.
And that's part of dissociation. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes. I read on a psychiatrist blog that one of the cameramen from the National Geography channel got caught by a lioness.
Oh,
And he
wow.
was recalling his event saying, I'm in the lioness mouth, yet I am not feeling anything. And I'm kind of, yeah. So it's that the opiate being released so that we don't feel anything in anticipated death. Because we have that neuroception of that's it, I'm gonna die.
Wow. And just now getting tingles, picturing myself or imagining that. You're going to want to not feel anything if you're in a position like that. And the body is so wise to be able to flood you with that.
Yes, exactly. The body and the brain, so that you don't feel like this is not happening to you because you're observing from up here. So then in a structural dissociation, I will go into it in detail soon, there is an observing self and an experiencing self. And so the
Okay. All
information
right.
about the event is held into those two selves, structurally dissociated from each other.
All right. So for someone who doesn't have any in-depth experience with structural dissociation, you're speaking with a person right now. I'm eager to learn. How would you define structural dissociation, and how does it differentiate from these dissociative responses you've mentioned, if at all?
Yes. Okay. And so under dissociation, so I'm going back a little bit to dissociation, but that also tap into structural dissociation. One might experience dissociative amnesia, where they will have gaps in the memory. A lot of clients mention that they can't remember information about their childhood from whatever age, from 9 to 11, 6 to 8. So that's, amnesia about past events. Some people experience amnesia about the present, where they've lost time and they can't remember what happened during that period of time that they can't remember.
Okay. In this dissociative amnesia, is it similar to something, or is a fugue state a expression of dissociative amnesia where you have a present sense experience of not being aware of what you're doing or not having any memory of what you've done, that fugue, FUGUE state? Yeah. Is that similar?
I think in a fugue state is that the person is also going away, and so they can find, when they come back to their consciousness, they can find themselves in a different state or in a different town. This is what I'm understanding of a fugue state.
The human brain is remarkable.
When there's been a lot of trauma, absolutely. Janina Fisher explains that this is the ingenious way the brain has helped the child cope during during the traumatic childhood.
Where you have a lot more capacity to be imaginative and creative and really get into another world, so to speak. Children seem apparently to have more access to that than adults as we grow up. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, I think children definitely have this beautiful ability to be so imaginative and have a fantasy world and daydream where this is absolutely healthy. But when it comes to structural dissociation, that was really helpful at the time of the trauma. But what happened is that the information about the traumatic event is therefore held into a different memory network of the sense of self. So if we go back a little bit, Pierre Janet, who was a French psychiatrist who was the pioneer of this theory of the structural dissociation, explain. Now the work has been worked on by a few researchers here in the States, Kathy Steele, Vanden Hart, and I can't pronounce the name of the researcher. I'm not doing a good job at it. But there are three researchers who have taken up on the work of Pierre Janet. And so he explains that the personality is a structure of biopsychological systems, action systems. And there's two categories. The first category is about daily life, functioning. And the second category is defense mechanism. Now, those action systems are innate. It's the work of evolution, and all mammals has got them. And so in the daily functioning category, we have action systems of attachment, environment exploration, like play, study, work. We got the action system of energy management, eat and sleep, caretaking, reproduction. So this is the category of the executive functioning. And then we've got the category of the coping mechanisms. And here we have fight, flight, faint, freeze, attachment cry in babies, and recuperation and wound care. And so these are innate, and just as the daily functioning action system, they happen to us, same as obviously the defense mechanism. And so, in those, each action system is directed toward their own goal action. So therefore, they also have their own way of thinking, feeling, behaviors, and body sensations. Very much what the polyvagal theory explains about when we are taken away from that ventral vagal nerve into the sympathetic state. Suddenly, we are really focused on either fight or on protection. So either flight, the stressful event, or fight or defense. And there we're going to have, a different way of feeling, different way of perceiving, different way of relating and feeling in the body, and thinking about ourselves and the events.
And is this a conceptual framework whereby clinicians can seek to understand these different areas of interacting, whether they're conscious or subconscious, and then apply them to the clients that they treat? Or is this something that is also communicated to the people that we support, or just a the general population of people who would be helpful to understand this sort of stuff? What's your sense of that?
Absolutely. So a lot of psychoeducation on what has happened to them and how the brain has ingeniously helped them cope. So, we have three types of structural dissociation. The first one is primary dissociation, and it goes under the PTSD and the acute stress disorders. So here we assume that the individual had a relatively integrated sense of self. So those action systems have naturally progressed into a sense of integration. So, and in terms of integration, the way you are at home with your kids, the way you take care of your kids is different from the way you are with your mates, for instance, or when you, or the way you are at work. So we have different parts of our sense of self, and this is really healthy and really adaptive, which might slightly change across context. I often laugh with my clients. I tell them I have my psych self, I have my mom self, my wife self, my sister self, best friend self. How weird would that be if I brought my sister self to the session today? So I tell them my husband does not like my psych self.
I think yes, my wife can so totally agree with that one. And we can okay, I'll speak for myself. Where it's so hard because you do it so often every single day. You engage in your psych self or your therapeutic self, even being therapeutic, which is different to the psych self, and you try to apply those things in your day-to-day life with your family. They look at you like, why are you listening like that? Or why are you why are you summarizing the weather? You're like, what the hell you feel? It's weird.
Yeah. But in this situation, don't you feel that, you have to tap into that work self? If one of your friends come to you with a problem, you're gonna go, okay, what would I do this? How would I approach that at work?
Yeah, it's when you adopt that work self in situations of non-crisis that gets a weird look.
Yes. So you feel you have to tap into that now, right?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, but it's somehow integrated, it's flexible, and it's very adaptive. So in primary structural dissociation, we assume that the person has an integrated sense of self, and then they experience a traumatic event. That traumatic event has activated the action system of defense, fight, flight, or faint freeze. And then, the information is held separated from the executive functioning self, from the daily life self.
So the executive functioning, are you speaking in terms of executive function from a prefrontal perspective, where the brain is concentrating and able to make decisions and just go do that sort of stuff? Okay, you can see you're nodding. Yeah, that's an important distinction to make.
Yes, and so it's held into this right side, the right side of the brain. And in the literature, they refer to those either emotional parts of our sense of self or traumatized parts of our sense of self, versus the apparently normal part, which is in charge of the executive functioning of daily activity, taking care of business part.
Right.
And it hasn't been integrated because it's too much, too fast. Every time the person might try to think or talk about, the trauma, the accident, or the stressful event, it brings back all of the information that is kept structurally dissociated into that memory network. So if we are talking about a serious car accident, is going to cause all the body to feel what was felt at the time, and the intense fear or terror, and that's not good at all. And that's when those avoidant coping mechanisms in the PTSD diagnosis come up. Anything to avoid remembering, thinking, resemblance of this, anything that relates to the trauma.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. All of this work around and this discussion around different parts of oneself, it looks very synonymous to things like schema therapy and internal family systems therapies, where you identify different parts of oneself and then you work towards integrating. Especially internal family systems seems to be the primary function. I can see that you're nodding for our clients who are listening. Are you aware of clients who are listening? Our audience who are listening. I use this word clients too often. Okay. Do you want to tell me a little bit about the relationship between that, or do you feel like there's something else that needs to be addressed beforehand?
There is also secondary and tertiary structural dissociation. And to go back to your question, yes, those parts and therefore part work that is necessary in therapy will make a lot of sense for the individual to understand, the dissociated sense of self. But what I have found is that when we've got secondary structural dissociation or tertiary structural dissociation, in my clinical experience, schema therapy is too overwhelming, doesn't work. Because in schema therapy, the client is asked to sit in the chair and to be that part and to feel that part and notice how that part thinks. But in secondary and tertiary structural dissociation, it's all about avoiding that part, because that part holds too much traumatic material and it's too intense. And also the parts have acquired their own internal relationships, because they blame themselves, or they feel guilty or ashamed for the trauma that has happened. So then there is this internal relationship between her parts, where one part might be really fearful of another part, or really ashamed or disgusted by another part. So schema therapy is too intense because it asks the client to feel and be that part, which is all about the disorder, where it's all about avoiding that part.
I could understand how that would be so confronting to someone. You're trying to avoid this major thing that has happened to you, and then a therapist is telling you, hey, why don't we just get into that thing, and you fully relive that thing from that thing's perspective. I'd be running for the hills if I didn't have a really robust capacity to sit with that.
Yes. So schema therapy is an amazing therapy with, borderline personality disorder. But if there is trauma-related BPD, then it becomes too overwhelming to sit in that part. And so that's where IFS is so beautiful, because you talk through the host.
Yes, there's a sense of, so IFS discusses, for those who aren't aware of IFS who are listening, internal family systems. My understanding of it, and Cecile, you add or correct me if I'm misrepresenting anything, is there's a conglomerate of various parts that tend to either manage your day-to-day behavior or come to the rescue when you're feeling too overwhelmed. And that coming to the rescue could mean you just need to get out of there, you need to use a substance, or you need to do a particular activity to just take yourself out of that sense of feeling. And then there's the sense of self that is called self with a capital S, where you observe these parts, and these parts tend to try to protect a underlying often younger part of oneself, which has been, they use the word exiled, where they have been forgotten about and not addressed. And these managers, whether that's through criticism or through humor or through other ways, they try to manage these feelings and satisfy this internal sense of, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And IFS is all about identifying these parts and then working towards integrating these parts into oneself from the perspective of the self, the observing self. Have I done that justice, Cecile?
Yes, absolutely. And you've mentioned a few things, like those parts that will take care of younger parts. That refers to the action system of caretaking, right? And then you've mentioned parts that will be self-destructive through substance, right? This is probably the flight action system, to avoid. So it goes back to the same thing, where all of those parts of our sense of self are based on the innate action system that we came up with, our blueprint. And so those excited parts are the parts that have of our sense of self, who have experienced the trauma, and through dissociation, depersonalization, where the parts one observed, one experienced, and then we have those younger sense of self.
In a way, they're fractured parts of ourselves.
It's a fractured sense of self, because what structural dissociation is that breakdown in our natural ability to integrate those action systems to make our whole personality structure. And then now, if it's secondary structural dissociation, we have one part who takes care of business, and here you refer to that the self, which I think this what is the part that is able to be in executive functioning. And then, sorry, I lost my train of thought, Emil.
Yeah, that's okay. You were talking about parts and how different types of parts, how they relate to different functioning systems within structural dissociation.
Yes. And the traumatized part, the younger sense of self, are those held in the right side of the brain, where you have the defense action system. If a child will submit, will totally collapse in front when experience brutal violence or just violence. But when attacked, we will still have the fight, flight, freeze action system triggered, but they can't be felt, because if a child is going to feel flight and run away, that's going to make things worse. And maybe they tried once, but now they've learned that they have to repress and suppress those parts. But those parts are still going to acquire information about themselves based on the events, and body sensation and affects that will be different from the part who experienced the trauma, but when they were in total collapse.
Is there, in the concept of structural dissociation, is there an observing self that is synonymous with I don't know, DBT's wise mind, or other types of noticing these different parts as they're in action, but they are separate to the parts themselves? There's a core essential concept of the human that is able to notice these parts and integrate these parts, or are they just islands?
I think the more chronic and severe the trauma is during childhood, then it's going to create more fragmentation of the sense of self, of those action systems. And and because of further need to dissociate. So, and because the part who takes care of business, the part who needs to go to school, the part who needs to go to work, is so phobic of those emotional parts that they try as much as possible to not know anything about those parts. And that's where you get the dissociative amnesia, where clients can't remember a significant period of time, because this is held into a separate, dissociated memory network within an action system.
It takes a lot to balance these parts from a clinical point of view. A clinician who's coming in and attempting to conceptualize the client. This seems like a whole conceptual process where we need to sit down and see what part is being represented in this session, or which parts are people switching into when they're feeling highly dissociated. Does that sound familiar, or am I making it more than it is?
No, that's totally right what you're saying. It's not that the client switches into this part per se, because they don't do it on purpose, but it happens to them.
Okay.
So to go back to the previous question, is that if the level of trauma and dissociation, and therefore fragmentation of the sense of self, is high, the goal of therapy is to try and help the client who takes care of, the part who takes care of business, to be able to slowly recognize those parts and slowly feel different towards these parts. And so, a lot of the time I would tell my clients, so you didn't want to do that? They might come and say, I was really angry and I raged and I threw things, and then I'm so upset, threw things on the floor, and I'm so upset because I scared the kids and I'm such a bad person. And so you go, hang on, but did you want to do that? No, I did not want to do that. So this happened to you, right? This happened to you. You didn't do this. So you slowly create this little bit of distance for the client to realize that, and they know that they have parts, right? But to realize that this is another part of my sense of self that got triggered because of information in the environment that, remembered or activated a memory in that action system.
Okay. This type of, okay, the way that I'm understanding this, I mean, IFS would work perfectly with this kind of conceptualization, where it's completely non-pathologizing. The way that you're describing it, there's no, it's non-pathologizing in the sense that we can understand the things all serve a purpose for the person within that situation. Now, we can pathologize it, and I'm doing inverted commas with my fingers because that's what clinicians or psychologists, or depending on or psychiatrists that are informed by things like the DSM, we need to, I don't know, categorize it in a particular way. But it's much bigger than that from what I'm hearing you say. And I suspect that people who have a very high sense of personal responsibility, whether that's through I'm responsible for everything that I do, and I have a low threshold for failure, and I need to take responsibility for my actions, would have a very difficult job at understanding that this is something that happened to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So the higher the person is able to function in their adulthood, then the more I find, the more rigid they are and avoiding and phobic of the traumatized part, because those parts make me not function. And they've done such a great job at dissociating the content from their consciousness so that they could take themselves to uni, to work, and do a great job.
And I would actually say there's in my perspective, you may agree or disagree. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a sense that at that point in time, that's something that the person has been able to accept and work through and move forward with. And if it's not causing any overt distress for them, then all the more power to you. It's only when it crosses into the line of it's causing some issues for my personal or relational situations, which it often does, but that you would want to look into that. What are your thoughts around that?
No, absolutely. If the person has been able to function and they haven't experienced anything negative, then that's fine. They don't, that's great. But when, like you said, because to be able to dissociate so much from the traumatic content, that's going to create a sense of detachment from her sense of self, but also from other people. It's going to cause some numbing. And so the person is not going to be able to experience, yes, those traumatic emotions, but they won't be able to also experience positive emotions.
I think that's a good point. It's not just that negative emotions are blunted, it's also that the positive emotions can be blunted as well.
Yeah.
And they might even become alexithymic, where it comes down to not knowing their own personal experiences, whether it's happy or sad.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Most clients with a childhood history of trauma, they are not able to name their emotion or recognize what they are, because either they were not taught, that skill of emotion regulation, stress tolerance, but also because they've been so phobic of experiencing any of those emotions that it's totally out of consciousness and they haven't been able to develop that skill.
This is fascinating. I have a lot of questions that just come up as they go, but is there something that you needed to clarify or expand on based on what you've said so far?
Um, yeah, I think we're right.
All
Just
right.
in terms of secondary and tertiary structural dissociation, the difference is that now, because the trauma was so pervasive into the child day-to-day functioning, that the sense of self is now comprised by um, two or more parts that take care of business. So not only is there that they have lots of emotional um, traumatized parts, but now they also have a fragmented sense of self in relation to those daily functioning. So one part in tertiary structural dissociation, one part might take care of cooking, one might take care of work, one might take care of taking care of the kids. But in secondary structural dissociation, it's only one part that takes care of business and several emotional parts, which makes the
I,
which is the difference between DID, a dissociative identity disorder, tertiary structural dissociation, versus the dissociative disorder, the otherwise specified dissociative disorders, complex PTSD.
yes, and this is that's where my mind went to when it comes that in terms of dissociative identity disorder, commonly and historically known as multiple personality disorder. For those who aren't aware of dissociative identity disorder, that's when these parts get fractured and individualized and personified in various almost various presentations that make up who that person is, so much so that they can have different biomarkers such as eyesight and blood levels and blood pressure gauges, and even I think it is even immune and glucose responses. They've done research that these these different personalities have significantly different biomarkers, and they really are different personalities. I can see that you're contemplating something. Is there something you want to add to that or take away from that?
Yes, so that will be the extreme DID presentation. But also, they are not different personalities. They are just different parts of her sense of self. There is one personality. But if the child, if the child was sexually abused at night, right? And that happened over and over and over and over again, right? So that activates the action system of submission, total submission. And if it happened a lot, then this action system, this action system starts to have a lot of events to refer from. And so they start to have their own life story. That's where they take the I statement. That's where they become elaborated and emancipated, rather than being a different personality. It's still the same person, but look at it as it's a different memory network within the person's
Yes.
brain.
Yeah, and it would be difficult for a person from in a common vernacular standpoint to be like, oh well, that guy's got multiple personalities, or that girl's got multiple personalities, and find it difficult to understand, well, no, that's there's one personality is just made up of a whole range of different parts that are vying for attention depending on the situation. Does that seem accurate to say?
What do you mean vying for attention?
Yes, yeah. So I'll clarify. When we vie for attention, it tends to be, I'm thinking of from an IFS perspective, where we may have different parts that arise in a certain situation that try to manage that situation, and then kind of go back, and then there might be another part that might come in, and there might be other times where you're in conflict at that same time, trying to balance multiple parts. Think of cognitive dissonance, and that may be manifested in various arguments within oneself. I'm probably speaking more generally here rather than clinically or theoretically. So it's probably good to differentiate between that general presentation and what comes to be a clinical presentation. If you have any thoughts on that.
So those parts get triggered at, right? They get triggered at by the present and any stimulus that might resemble anything, information held in their memory network. So
okay,
yeah. So let's say someone experiences, you're in the office with your client, and the therapist next door is walking, and that makes like really loud sound, and suddenly your client freezes. That has triggered information within the person's brain that is contained into a specific memory network, a dissociated memory network within an action system that might have reminded them of something that happened in childhood, right? And so then that's going to cause the part to the action system to be activated into freeze, because now there is information that has triggered, and that's what's happening. So I explain to my client the same way as, if you're walking down the street from home to the bank on a summer day, and you pass a fish and chip shop, and suddenly the smell of the fish and chip shop, takes you back to a time in childhood when you were, on vacation with your family down the beach, and you feel so happy and blissful. But essentially, from home to the bank, there's nothing blissful happening, nothing to make you so elevated, right? It's a memory that has been triggered as a result of the smell.
Yes, yeah. And as you speak, there's a flood of memories that are coming up in my mind. So I could understand how even discussion about this, rather than sensory perception, can also trigger these memory states to arise. And context dependent memory states that can arise and influence a person's felt sense depending on how they do life.
Yes, absolutely. That's why they might, in session, you might start with something, and suddenly the client takes you on this whole journey, and you go, hang on, can we just go back to that? No, because that's going to activate content, and therefore a part of their sense of self that might feel ashamed or guilty, with really intense body sensation and an altered sense of altered way of relating to themselves because of that part.
Oh, that's triggered another memory or a consideration of themes. I speak about parallel and vertical processing in therapy when it comes down to sometimes clients and clinicians may see things, may interpret things in parallel. So they think of one thing, and then that reminds them of something else, and then something else, and then something else, and they all relate to the same thing. But then that could be very difficult in getting back to the original point. whereas
Mhm.
vertical processing is tense that one follows another, follows another, follows another, and they're all in line. And I often smile because if you as a clinician tend to be a parallel processor, just in general life, and then you're paired with a client who's a parallel processor, the session just goes up and down, and you kind of think about, where the hell did we start, and what's going on there. So there's
Yeah.
that utility of integrating these two levels of processing, but that's interesting how you conceptualize it from that standpoint too,
Yes.
in
So,
terms
you know,
of structural dissociation. Yeah.
yes. So for you, it might just be a very wide interest. Maybe it is for your client as well, but if they have complex PTSD, but you know, you will feel it. You will feel that an emotional or traumatized part, you will see it in the presentation, has been triggered, and now the content is slightly different, or the way it's expressed, it's slightly different. There is a shift. You can feel it. You can see it. But what it sounds like what you're talking is very much a beautiful curiosity.
Yes. Okay. So that's a good distinction to make, because that can work conceptually great, because like you and I, for example, may have a conversation right now that is broad range, and we may start one area and go touch on a whole range of different areas. But then when it comes from a clinical point of view, that looks completely different if a person's reactivated through a traumatic incident, and then the content changes as well as the process of the session and how they present. Are you Can you give me an example of that?
Mm, so a client might start, you know, with one story of what happened, you know, at work, and then they might say, you know, but they always mistreat me and I'm always rejected. And then they might, you know, you might see some tearfulness, and then they will switch to a completely different topic, and they might talk about how, you know, their husband was unfair, and then they got a text message from mom, and mom also was really mean, and so you will, and then they might go, oh, I feel so much better, and then they go back to, so that's, you know, that's the very much um, dissociative complex, could be complex PTSD with some borderline traits. Again, every client is different. You know, you might have a client that we start with something, and, you know, a topic, and you might try to summarize or go a certain direction, and then suddenly they feel really defensive, and then they go, no, that's not what I meant. What I meant was more like that. And you go, but at the beginning of the conversation you said what I've repeated back. And yeah, and so then you know that there might be a part that is highly defensive, or might idolize the parent, whereas at the beginning was more perhaps an emotional or traumatized part that said, you know, mom was really mean, and when she said this, she said that, it was really painful and made me feel so ashamed. And so you try to give an explanation about, you know, why perhaps mom did that, or how it was not fair that mom did that. And then you get, no, but that's not really what I meant. That's a defensive part that takes you completely on a different trail of thoughts or intention.
This is interesting, because the utility of psychodynamic therapies tend to come into this, at least from a conceptual standpoint, when I hear you describe this. Now, their example that I'd give is conceptualizing something like complex post-traumatic stress disorder compared to ordinary post-traumatic stress. Is sort of like there is an ordinary person PTSD, but as it appears in the DSM. And my understanding is that complex PTSD has not yet, or developmental trauma has not yet appeared in the DSM, despite significant pushes by by hundreds of clinicians
Mhm.
to present evidence for its requirement. Uh, you've referenced complex PTSD, but we haven't taken a stab at defining it. And I wonder, is there a definition that you tend to think of when you look at complex PTSD and how that is different to PTSD ordinarily?
Mm. Yes. So complex PTSD is mentioned in the ICD-11. And so it goes into the category of the secondary structural dissociation. That's when the individual has experienced significant and prolonged childhood trauma. And as a result of that, they might experience a significant difficulty in their emotion regulation and the distress tolerance. So they might, have like anger outburst, rage, really, really strong emotion that they are not able to, reckless and self-destructive behaviors. But they might also experience numbing and no positive emotions, dissociation, and really intense emotional response to minor triggers. They might also experience a really negative sense of self with strong worthlessness and defectiveness and strong emotions of guilt, shame, and failure to have acted differently in relation to the trauma. And they will also experience significant difficulties in relationships where it's a love you or hate you type of relationships. But they need to meet criteria for a single PTSD as well, or for the PTSD.
Okay.
They need to meet criteria for the PTSD diagnosis in addition to those symptoms, and they might also experience suicidal ideation and behaviors, chronic depression, somatic complaints.
What if they don't meet criterion A events such as overt sexual, physical, and etc. abuse, but they still have symptoms consistent with Cptsd that have occurred through neglect or abandonment and that sort of stuff? Would they still be from now, just to define, ICD stands for International Classification of Diseases, which is the World Health Organization's summary of diagnostic, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, books or manuals and the rest of that. So they have Cptsd, but DSM doesn't have Cptsd. And the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual in its second edition also has Cptsd. So there are a couple diagnostic manuals that include it, but the DSM doesn't. Are you saying that the ICD requires a DSM diagnosis of PTSD to be qualified for Cptsd, or are you just not aware of that?
The ICD-11 also have, the PTSD diagnosis. So you can meet the criteria for the PTSD diagnosis based on the ICD-11, which is very similar to the DSM. And then you also have to meet those criteria of emotion regulation, social difficulties, and an altered sense of self, really negative altered sense of self. But if there hasn't been physical violence and life threat, then, and it was more neglect and abandonment, it's likely that the person will present with a personality disorder, like perhaps borderline personality disorder, narcissism. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is interesting because my understanding is that BPD, for example, borderline personality disorder, has I might be getting these figures slightly incorrect, but something like upwards of 80% of people with that presentation have had a significant trauma that has happened in their day-to-day. And a lot of that could relate to abandonment and attachment trauma, as alongside other types of traumas. When it comes down to these diagnoses, is there really a fundamental difference between being categorized as having Cptsd compared to BPD if the presentation is the same?
Some clients with BPD haven't been, haven't had any violence happen upon their body, but more they were neglected or emotionally, ridiculized. So emotional abuse rather than physical abuse. There may have been psychological abuse, like being called names all the time, ridiculized, or not attended to when necessary. So they don't meet criteria for PTSD. But because of those events, then that has impacted on their sense of self and the way they regulate their emotion. And so they might have an angry part because being ridiculized all the time or being mistreated or with an overprotective caretaker might lead to a lot of anger. But then this anger can't really be expressed because it's always reprimanded. So then this anger needs to be dissociated, needs to not be felt, needs to be repressed and suppressed, so that the child can in some way feel safe or loved or be able to maintain some type of relationship with the caregiver. But if they've experienced significant anger, the anger doesn't evaporate. It gets stuck in the body.
You've given a lot of context on everything that we've spoken about in terms of PTSD, Cptsd, the structural dissociation in general as it applies to trauma. If you could summarize just one part of that one, the structural dissociation, before we move into another area of this discussion, how would you best summarize structural dissociation, just to recap everything that we've learned so far?
So structural dissociation is when the event was too much for a child to be able to integrate into their sense of self. And therefore, because of those action systems that have been triggered during the event, it's being held into a dissociated memory network of their sense of self. And so if it was chronic abuse, then now what happened is that we have a lot of separated sense of self parts with different information about how they relate to themselves, the environment, and other people. So we have lots of different emotion and traumatized parts rather than different personality within the same person. But they all fit within that one personality.
That sounds like a really good segue into our next area of discussion, which is very much related. So I want to look at treatment, and I want to look at addressing this and how this looks like clinically. Before we get into that sense or that discussion, is there anything you wanted to add to what you've said so far?
No, so I think, again, primary structural dissociation is when the emotional part, it's one event, one traumatic event, the emotional part is really focused on the memories of the trauma. Secondary structural dissociation, like I just said, is lots of emotional, youngest part of the sense of self that have now been elaborated because they've experienced a lot of traumatic events. So they've got a pool of events to refer from, and therefore they've got their own life story. And so they haven't been able to be integrated into this coherent and cohesive sense of self. And then tertiary structural dissociation is when now we have also lots of traumatized parts, but also a few different parts who take care of the day-to-day activities, because trauma impact happened all the time, even when they even during those day-to-day activities.
It's a complex set of presentations, and an all too common one in the clinical sphere.
But also what you've mentioned before is that all the parts had a purpose, and all the parts, even the meanest one, the one who might tell the person to kill themselves, to self-harm, even those parts, when we look into them, they are good. There is no bad parts, like Dick Schwartz is saying.
That's a good way of looking at it. Richard Schwartz is an amazing, the originator of IFS, amazing at non-pathologizing treatment, and that's what we need in this sphere when we're dealing with some complex presentations and traumas.
Yes, absolutely, definitely. And if we feel that we are working with a client and we get, are self-defensive with any of their parts or frustrated, that's when we need to, to take a break, really take some distance, take it to therapy, to supervision, because even the most resistant, the meanest part, they all had a purpose to help the individual during that trauma that we can't even imagine. Our child went through that.